And so we've talked extensively about EOY 4, and the bulk of your work during the submission cycle is going to be dedicated to end of year 4. However, your knowledge of the students with disabilities and certainly the SELPA's review is going to be required for incidents. So we will very quickly talk about incidents, and then we'll wrap up and conclude today's training. And
before you go on, Nate, I just wanted to really be clear to the special education data coordinators. What he's about to talk about is all information that's captured in the student information system. It's all in the SIS. Okay, so all of the incident information is coming from PowerSchool or Aries or whatever system you use, and your responsibility as special education data coordinators is to look at the subset of students with disabilities and make sure that they're reporting those incidents in the SIS correctly. That's it. And at the SELPA level, your responsibility is to look at issues of disproportionality within the districts within your SELPA. Okay, continue.
Thank you, Brandon, for putting it in perspective for us. And so the purpose, right, for reporting student incidents is to satisfy the requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Also, it's a way to identify the persistently dangerous schools by the Uniform Management Information Reporting System, or UMERS. We also want to provide suspension and expulsion counts for several reasons. Again, it's needed for IDEA for those students with disabilities, but also those counts are needed to for accountability when you're looking at suspension or expulsion rates. And then we also need information regarding the use of restraints and seclusion for students with disability or general education to fulfill the statutory requirements of AB 2657. So those are the legislative reasons that what we need this information. The reason why we've included it today is that there are several reports from end of year 3 that are relevant to students with disabilities. And those reports will provide us with the counts of students with disabilities that have been removed to an interim alternative educational setting, the counts of students with disabilities that have been unilaterally removed by school. This is not the IEP team. Due to offenses related to drug, weapon, or serious bodily injury, count of students with disabilities suspended or expelled, and the duration of that disciplinary action. Then those counts of students with disabilities that were subject to any kind of disciplinary removal, and the total number of times students with disabilities were subject to any kind of disciplinary removal. And so identifying what constitute an incident, right? Incidents are violations or that have been outlined in Education Code sections 48900 and 48915, right? Even if they did not result in a suspension or expulsion, these violations that are outlined in Ed Code 48900 and 48915 must be reported. Incidents resulting in the use of behavioral restraints and seclusions, even if they are not violations of Ed Code 48900, 48915 must be reported. And there is Ed Code that identifies and describes restraints and seclusions. I would ask you to reference 49005.1. And so what I had to do, and what I suggest you do, if this is, because this is just a quick overview, is I just Googled CA Ed Code, and then I type in the number, and then you will see exactly what I'm talking about. But also, all your statutory offenses are in your CalPADS code set under student offenses, and then the definitions for statutory, whether it's mechanical restraint or physical restraint, you can find that in the data guide, right? And so, because so many of our students with disabilities are served by MPS schools, you need to know that the same rules and requirements for you at the LEA level are at the MPS school. And so while this information comes from your student information system, what relationship does that data coordinator have with your MPS schools? Usually the special education staff would be the point of contact for those MPS schools. So you have to take it upon yourself to ensure that your MPS schools know what's required of them, and you have a mechanism in place to share the information. Brandy was very poignant in pointing out when we did the training that Many of your NPS schools are not using information system or even special education systems that you all use. And so the transfer of data may have to go on an Excel spreadsheet. It may have to be in a PDF. However you share the data, you have to make sure that you have those mechanisms in place, because the same information is required for those students. Remember, you have to report these students because their primary enrollment is at your LEA in CalPADS. And we do have resources for that and training for NPS school. And we can share those links out or point you in the direction at the end of today's training, right?
Nate, there's a question that I think is a really good one, and I was wondering if you guys could answer it. So if the NPS sends an Excel doc for the sync, SERS, and soft files, is there a way to directly upload this data into CalPADS rather than entering it into the SIS first?
There is, but you don't want to do that. One, with all CalPADS data that comes from your student information system, you want it in your SIS because you want to be able to reconcile that data. Two, this can pose a problem if you have multiple NPS schools, because each NPS school has the same group code. It's all going to be 0001 or 6 zeros followed by a 1. And so I would definitely advise you to submit the data to your student information system first. Also, each record will have each student has a local ID number, right? And this is used for validation. The data coming from your NPS school may not be the same because they have a different system than what you have in your local student information system. And so even if you give them the SSID, you would want to also have to give them your local ID number. So this could pose problems. The best and safest way to do this is put this data into your student information system first. However, to answer your question, yes, if the Excel file follows the structure of the CalPADS file types, you can submit data into CalPADS from the Excel file. And there are templates that you can access through the CalPADS user manual that will assist in this. However, incident information is 3 individual file types. I would highly advise you to consolidate the data in your student information system prior to uploading to CalPADS. Kyron, did you have something else?
No, you said it better.
Okay. All right. And so again, that was a great question. Thank you, Brandy. And that lends itself to the first bullet point, right? You need policies and procedures in place to identify, document, and report incidents involving restraints between your NPS schools and your LEA, right? You should ensure that staff is appropriately trained, and also CalPADS administrators should not have to determine what discipline records are reportable incidents. And so again, not just you, but your student, your SIS data coordinators, you want to lean on your subject matter experts and your administration, right? Because this is just the overwhelming data collection. But the truth is, be told, is you're going to have to be proactive. If you see a discrepancy or a problem, you're going to have to identify it and then provide that information or ask what it is that's missing or what you need from those either at the NPS school or your administration, or like in the case of restraints and seclusions, you have to ask for that training or explain why your district needs training to, to know what constitute restraints and seclusions, which brings us to the terminology. And so this slide, I'm not going to read every bullet point. We're short on time, but I do like to point out that you want to make sure you look at the code set and you review the definitions, because we all know what seclusion is, but there's a specific definition what constitutes seclusion when we talk about behavioral incidents for student reporting, right? And so this is an abbreviated version, but it says seclusion is the involuntary confinement of a pupil alone in a room or area from which the pupil is physically prevented from leaving. And so I bring this up because when I was in school, I talked a lot. That's probably why I do that now. And I was put in a little side closet kind of area when I was in middle school. And it was one teacher, one classroom. And I initially thought, oh, I had experienced seclusion growing up. However, that's not true because I wasn't physically prevented from leaving. I could have got up at any time. And so, we associate our understanding of some of these definitions, but they're all related to a code or a field, and they have specific definitions. So you want to make sure that you review the CFS, the field specifications document, as well as the CalPETS code set. And that's the same with mechanical restraint and physical restraint. You want to make sure that you look at those definitions. And there's several different elements in incident reporting, right? And so we report all incidents for each student at each school. Of course, those are either restraints and seclusions, or those are offenses. They are incidents that had offenses related to 48900 to 48915 of the California Ed Code. If you do have incidents that need to be reported, they will reflect the duration of any disciplinary action, whether it be suspension or expulsion. Some incident results do not require a duration. There's actually some incidents that have other means of correction. So you'll see that could be a referral or restorative justice. Some incidents don't result in any discipline at all. That's code 400. So you will see that when you're looking at reports. Students may have multiple offenses committed, and they reflect statutory offenses. If there's a weapon used, the weapon category will be used to describe what kind of weapon it was, whether it was a handgun or shotgun, or knife or other weapon. And then for our students with disabilities, the last two bullets, each student's required to have an indication of if the student was removed to an interim alternative setting, and also if that student received instructional support. And of course, it's very important that your student information system data coordinators understand that instructional support for our students with disability includes the services related to their IEPs. And so during the pandemic, there's been no change to the reporting requirements for end of year 3 with regards to discipline and behavioral incidents, right? And so you must submit and report all the data that is outlined in Ed Code 48900, 48915, or if it's an incident that involved restraint or seclusion. And so we're going to move very quickly into reports. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. There will be 3 certification errors that you might want to look for and assist your SIS data coordinator with, right? And that's CERT 157, missing invalid incident result code for and a removal to alternative reason code combination. And so, you identify if a student is a student with disability, and maybe you can help identify what this invalid combination is, right? If a student doesn't have like a CERT 158, if a student doesn't have that field populated, missing removal to interim alternative setting reason code, you first would identify whether or not the student at the time or on the incident date was on an active IEP or ISP or IFSP. And then if the student is missing, you want to correct that through the student information system, or if the student wasn't, there's a counter to that. If the interim alternative setting reason is populated for a student that's not special ed, it will trigger an error. So that's the CERT 158, 159. You want to identify the eligibility for those errors for a student with disability, and then the correction determines whether or not the student was eligible at the time of the incident or not. Do they need these fields populated or not? So you may be called in to assist with a few of these errors. And then when you're looking at reports, the 3 specifically that you're going to want to look at, these are all the incident reports. It's a big data collection, but it may be relevant to look at 715, persistently dangerous schools, right? Specific offense codes, and the number of them will consider that school at risk. And so it's reflective of all students, right, and the schools they go to, but it may be one you want to look at. However, 1716, 1717, and 1718, and you can see in the title, are specific to students with disabilities. So 7.16 is incident, restraint, seclusion, and removals for students with disabilities count. And so you can see here are the removals or incidents of restraint and seclusion, right? And I'll tell you, your SIS data coordinator probably has no mechanism to, and no baseline of information to do anything with this report in terms of identifying the accuracy and appropriateness of the data reported. And so in the previous training, the question was asked, well, what is my role? What do I do? Again, this, the special education staff would definitely be needed to review these reports. Then report 7.17, unilateral removals for students with disabilities count. This is just a count of those students that were unilaterally removed, the number of removals, and you can see it's broken down by school, and then the disability category. And then 7.18 is the student list, and so you see the theme here. Student list reports are detailed reports that provide a lot more information, and you see the offense, the incident result, and incident information, and that's your student list. So those three reports you want to take a keen interest in: 7.16, 7.17, 7.18. Also, your SELPA has a version of these reports, and that's why end of year 3 has SELPA approval as well.